Welcome back to Unit 5, Lesson 2, Part 2 of the video. This part's optional unless you've missed class. And now we're going to discuss what are neuroglial cells. And simply put, these are the cells of the nervous system that support, protect, and nourish neurons. So that they don't actually conduct electrical signals, but they help support the cells that do. And the estimate is we have approximately 1 trillion neuroglial cells. So that's 10 for every 1 neuron supporting the neurons. There's many different kinds of neuroglial cells, and we're going to focus on only 2 kinds here. And these different kinds vary between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the 2 key kinds we're going to discuss actually have similar functions. They're just found in different parts of the body. So the first one is the Schwann cell, spelled S-C-H-W-A-N-N for its discoverer. The Schwann cell of the peripheral nervous system, PNS. And the tough word to say, oligodendroglial. Oligodendroglial cell of central nervous system. And it's sometimes aka, also known as oligodendrocyte. And if you're at home, go ahead and say this out loud. Practice it. Oligodendroglial. Oligodendroglial cell. Okay. We practice it in class. You might as well go ahead and practice saying it at home. Okay. And these are the key kinds we're going to discuss because both form a myelin sheath around axons. So myelin's important. It has 3 main functions. So which helps to first of all protect the neuron just from damage. It helps to insulate electrical signals that are traveling along the neuron. So that they do not essentially arc between neurons or between nerves. And finally, myelin helps to increase the speed of the electrical signal. And we'll discuss how that works when we actually discuss how the electrical signal is generated in neurons next day. So it increases speed of electrical signal. So 3 main functions of myelin, and myelin is the result of these Schwann cells and oligodendroglial cells. So how does that work? It works essentially by it forms a myelin sheath by wrapping around the axon like a piggy in a blanket. So a piggy in a blanket is the nickname for when you take a pancake and you wrap it around a sausage. Okay, and that's basically what these cells do. So if we take a picture here, or draw a picture here, if this, not very straight there. If we go straight across our page drawing an axon, we'll make this the terminal. And up here, we can have the dendrite. And the cell body. Okay, if this is the axon, what happens is you have something like a Schwann or oligodendroglial cell, depending on whether you're in the PNS or CNS. I remember oligodendroglial is the central nervous system because the brain's really complex, and that's where oligodendroglials are found, and it's probably one of the more complex words we're going to come across this year. Okay, so if you have this, it actually comes up here and it wraps itself around the neuron, in particular around the axon. So it wraps around and around and around. So we're just trying to fix this picture up so it looks a little more clear to identify. And it would come around and wrap itself around. But they're not long enough to cover the whole axon, so another one will come along and it'll wrap itself around. So it wraps itself around. And you get a series of these cells wrapping themselves around the entire length of the neuron's axon, and then you get these little gaps in between. They're wrapping side by side, but these little gaps have a special name and a special importance in the electrical signal that we'll discuss next day. For now, you just need to know the gaps are called nodes of Ranvier. Okay? And we'll talk about why they're important next day. But that's what myelination is. And when these cells wrap around, as a whole bunch of them together along the axon, it forms what we call the myelin sheath, which does the three functions we mentioned above: protects it, insulates the electrical signal, and helps the electrical signal travel faster. But this myelin sheath has a distinct appearance. It's the white appearance. And this is why we get the so-called gray matter and white matter in our brain. The gray matter is unmyelinated, and crosstalk and arcing can occur between neurons, whereas the white matter is myelinated, and typically this occurs when signals have to be travel over a longer distance or longer axon. Okay, so that's myelination. There's one more interesting thing. There's two different cells, we said, Schwann cells and oligodendroglial cells, and they don't function exactly the same. How they form their myelin around is slightly different, and also, interestingly, Schwann cells of PNS seem to help in nerve regeneration. In the PNS. So you can damage nerves, for example, to your hand, and over time they can repair themselves, and it seems to be able to repair itself in part thanks to the assistance of the Schwann cells. In contrast, oligodendroglial cells do not seem able to be able to support nerve regeneration. In the central nervous system. And this is, in part, contributes to the fact that we can't heal spinal cord or brain injuries because we can't regenerate nerves. This brings up an interesting question for scientists. What is the difference between these two cells? Because if we can understand why the Schwann cell can support regeneration, perhaps we can apply that to our central nervous system and help repair spinal cord and brain injuries. Now that we understand the basic structure of neurons, there's this concept of a reflex arc. And a reflex arc involves the various neurons we've talked about. So what is a reflex arc? It's essentially the simplest nerve pathway in our body. That can bypass the brain. So they aren't necessarily sending signals to the brain, meaning that they can operate very, very quickly. And this is a picture or diagram of a reflex arc. And what this is it's a cross section or a slice through your vertebrae. And this would be the back or dorsal side. Think of where a dorsal fin is on a whale. And this is the front or ventral side. And what you're looking at here is a little patch of skin that's been pricked with a needle. and this is considered your receptor. Sorry. In red, I'm going to color blue. Sorry, in red I'm going to color blue. That's interesting. In blue, I am going to color what is your sensory neuron. The signal travels along the neuron in this direction. So this is your sensory neuron. Another word for sensory neuron, if you remember, was your afferent neuron. Okay. In the middle, I'm going to color it in gray because it's part of the gray matter, which this sort of H or butterfly looking shape is. It's all gray matter, so they're showing one little interneuron in here, but this whole area is full of unmyelinated interneurons. So this is your interneuron. Maybe I can go with darker gray than that. Okay, that's better. There's your interneuron, and that's located in your spinal cord. And it's non-myelinated. Okay. And then in red, I'm going to color it red because it heads to muscle and it makes me think of red meat. Is your motor neuron. And your motor neuron attaches to an effector, which could be the muscle or a gland. So like a sweat gland or a tear gland secreting something. Saliva gland. Okay. So a reflex arc is the simplest and fastest pathway between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron initiating a response. It has 5 parts that we just described. Any reflex typically has 5 parts. There are some exceptions. There are some even simpler reflex arcs, but the first part is the sensory receptor. And this is actually part of the sensory neuron. It's on the dendrite end of the sensory neuron and detects stimuli, so a change in its environment, such as temperature, pressure, and texture. So you can tell if something's cold, it's wet, if it's painful, those types of things. It is then followed by the sensory neuron itself. What's the other word for sensory again? That's right. Afferent. That sends signal from what part of the nervous system to what part? Okay, from your peripheral nervous system to the, it's correct, central nervous system. Then in the middle, you have the interneuron. Located in spinal cord. That integrates info independent of the brain, so it might be receiving information from several neurons at once. Without actually sending that info to the brain. And connects with the motor neuron. So the whole interneuron is in the spinal cord, in the central nervous system, but it connects information from the peripheral nervous system into it and then out of it. The fourth part of a reflex arc is the motor protein, or motor neuron, sorry. So we have the motor neuron, which is also called a what? Afferent. The motor neuron goes to the effector. It's called the efferent. So sensory is afferent. Motor neuron is the efferent neuron. That carries signals from computer's not happy with me right now. Carry signals from central nervous system to the effectors of the what system? Correct, PNS. Which finally gets us to 5, which are the effectors themselves. You're going to have, at the end of reflex arc, there is some sort of effector. That responds to the motor signal. Such as muscles or glands. Now some examples of reflex arcs. Blinking, both unconscious and when something comes close to your eye. Okay. There's the knee-jerk reaction, which is actually due to hitting your patellar tendon. And there is the what's called the withdrawal reflex from pain. This involves a reflex arc that bypasses the brain, so you can pull your hand back, say, for example, if you're burning it, before too much damage is done. But sometimes an additional signal is sent to the brain so that we are aware of the pain and learn to avoid that situation in the future. Good. So that's reflex arcs. And now that we've talked about reflex arcs, we're going to talk about our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, because most of these do involve some reflex arcs and some higher level, if not conscious, thinking. So if we're going to talk about our parasympathetic and our sympathetic system, what we first have to recall is, how is the nervous system organized? So we very quickly looked at this last day, and we started out with, at the top was the nervous system. Then we could break the nervous system down into two main parts. The one here, central nervous system, versus, that's right, peripheral nervous system. We could then further break down the central nervous system into the big guy at the top, that's right, the brain, and the column down the middle, the spinal cord. And interestingly, reflex arcs that we talked about actually fit over on the peripheral nervous system side, but clearly connect with the spinal cord. And as we talked last day, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are constantly talking with each other and communicating with each other. So we can't really separate them in terms of how our nervous system functions, just more we separate them arbitrarily to help understand. So we have the peripheral nervous system. This can then be further broken down into sort of the sensory side, the receiving signal side, versus the motor side, which is the acting upon what you're sensing. The motor signals can be further broken down into autonomic, those that are unconscious, and what's called somatic, those which are conscious movements and responses. And weirdly enough, and I'm not going to test you on this because it's kind of an oddball, but many textbooks argue that even though they're a reflex arc below our conscious thought, they place them in the somatic system because they involve our skeletal muscles, and our skeletal muscles belong under the somatic system because they're controlled typically by conscious thought. So that's a weird place for a reflex arc. Sorry, not reflex arc, but that's where it fits. And I won't test you for that because I can understand how, if you understand that the autonomic is unconscious, why you might think reflex arc should fit under there. But instead, our autonomic includes two other things. What's called our sympathetic division or responses versus our parasympathetic. And when I describe these to you on the next page, we're going to describe basically their functions, but there is actually structural differences between the neurons that control your sympathetic system and those that control your parasympathetic system. Okay, so this is what we're going to focus on the next page because it kind of fits in here. It doesn't neatly fit anywhere, but it's really interesting to learn about. So sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And I was teasing a few of you last day when your startle response kicked in and telling you how some of your heart rates really jumped, and that was because your sympathetic system was very effective. Okay. So we'll go down here, and what are the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic responses? So we're not looking at the structure of the system, we're just looking at what they control in terms of our responses to stimuli. So we'll divide the page into a nice T-chart, and we'll put sympathetic here, and over on this side, parasympathetic. And sympathetic is essentially when you're in a situation of fear, stress, or competition. And what happens is your sympathetic system kicks in. Essentially, it is body is sympathetic to your plight. So whatever's causing you the stress. And tries to protect you. Sorry there, the computer was glitching, so I shut down Word and reopened it. Hopefully it's going to cooperate now. I won't count on it, but we can hope. So, body's sympathetic to your plight and tries to protect you, and it's called your fight or flight response, because the changes your body's going to make will enable you either to fight more effectively or be able to run away more effectively. Okay. So it causes the body to release epinephrine, which is another word for adrenaline. Adrenaline is more of a trademarked name. Epinephrine is the name for what your body makes. So it causes the body to release epinephrine and a closely related chemical, norepinephrine. You've probably heard of epinephrine in the terms of an EpiPen. This is what they're giving you if you're taking an EpiPen. So that causes the body to release those things, which in turn causes pupil dilation. This allows more light into your eyes so that you can see better, which is necessary if you're about to get into a fight or running away. It inhibits salivation. Many of you before a game or before high pressure situations will feel dry mouthed. That's your sympathetic system kicking in. And the reason it inhibits salivation is because it's also going to inhibit digestion. This is why it's not a good idea to eat a big meal before athletics. And it increases your heart rate, so that the blood can pump more effectively to your muscles so that you can fight or run. It increases your breathing rate so that you can get more oxygen to power those muscles. And it also increases glucose release by your liver so that you can power your muscles. Okay? And when we talk about the digestion unit, we will talk about what is the connection between glucose and your liver. Okay? The other side of the system is called your parasympathetic system. This is the part that maintains homeostasis. It's the part that basically is operating most of the time, or returns us to homeostasis after a sympathetic situation. This is often called the rest and digest, not or, but both. The rest and digest response, because that's what your body's most capable of doing when this parasympathetic system is involved. It basically is an antagonist. It does pretty much the opposite of the sympathetic system. So it causes pupils to constrict. And some of you will, hopefully not personally, but know of people who do various drugs, and you will see a change in like pupil dilation, and that will reflect what system is being stimulated or suppressed by that drug. It increases digestion, so salivation and digestion by stimulating release of digestive enzymes. It decreases heart rate, and this involves a different hormone. Involves acetylcholine, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the chemical signals in our body and our nervous system. Decreases breathing rate. So those are the key effects of your parasympathetic response. And if you want to look at it in a little more detail, here's a picture that shows the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system, and you can get a better idea of how these systems are influenced. So usually we'll have a set of parasympathetic nerves, for example, heading towards our pupil, and a sympathetic set heading towards our pupil, and they will send contradictory messages. If you have any questions about that, please come see me in class. Otherwise, have a really good day, and I will see you in class.